So this is now just taking us a little bit into those narratives and history, so maybe a little bit more existential questions. So having said all of this, I just thought I'd lay out 3 challenges, and I've called the one, how do we learn from the past? What do we learn about the past? And how does the past and the present interact? How are we doing on the time? Is it okay? Okay. So these are sort of fairly scattergunish approaches to this. But if we think of the how, for me, it raises a whole lot of questions. So whatever mechanism we're talking about in transitional justice, and I've talked about it very broadly, what is implicit within what we're trying to do? So is the idea that we're teaching people, we're uncovering the past, we're looking at the past, because somehow once we know that, it changes our ideas? What is the theory of change that's implicit within that? And I think that that's quite challenging, because often we tend to think of that in quite a linear way, and it's probably more difficult. The Guernica Peace Museum talks about the idea of thinking, reflecting, assessing, and acting. So they basically say, well, what you would be doing is firstly teaching people how to think, then teaching people how to reflect so that they would do things differently. That's quite different to a model of saying, well, if I learned more about this event, it would somehow change my mind. That's a different idea of teaching me to think and teaching me to reflect. That's a different idea. So I'm throwing that out for us to talk about. I think for me, the other big challenge in this area, when we think of the theories of change, is that there seems to have developed a model that the way that people change is if they have some sort of emotional connection to the past. And for discussion, I want to throw out and say, I'm actually not always that sure about that idea. So the idea is very much, if you go in and have this authentic experience in the torture chamber and you see the horrors of what happened to people, that you somehow won't repeat it. And that seems to permeate a lot of the education that is happening in the transitional justice field. Not so much maybe in the worlds that you all work in, but in transitional justice it's become quite a strong thing, these sort of museums of horror where you go in and you learn about the past. Now I think they have value, but a lot of the research shows that what happens is that people are already predisposed to attend to change, and there's not very much long-term research. How does it affect you? I've been to many museums that I thought were fantastic, but how do we track what that does to me 20 years down the line? I think the other challenge with some of that is that it also sometimes turns on a very Western idea of individualism, which is that if I learn about this, when I'm confronted with prejudice, I will act. I will do something different, which in certain contexts is absolutely true. When you're a child soldier in Liberia, no, it's not true. So you can be educated to what level you like, that you can make choices about doing right and wrong, but in a certain circumstance, that's sort of irrelevant. So I think sometimes it's quite a Western liberal idea that, when you learn about things, you'll have the power to act and to do things differently. I don't dispel that idea. I think it's an important idea, and I like people teaching that idea, but I think from a critical perspective, we have to raise those questions. There's other work which has happened in this area, and there's a guy called Peter Novick who writes about this, and it's very interesting because he basically says one of the challenges with a lot of this emotive way of trying to teach history and teach the past is it tends to draw us into the realm of the victim. Now, there's nothing wrong with being drawn into the realm of the victim, but what that does is it tends to distance us from the fact that we could be a perpetrator. So that you tend to go into it thinking, poor victims, we really shouldn't allow that to happen. And while you're thinking about that, you're not actually thinking, I could be the one under certain circumstances that did that. And I think that that's a valuable point. So that's my first set of challenges to talk about. My second set is, and this is familiar to all of you living here, which is what are we doing? What narrative are we creating about the past? And that's a massive challenge. Many of you more skilled than me in terms of history teaching and the types of issues that have to be dealt with. And are we dealing with dominant narratives, chosen narratives? And I quite like to play around with putting other words in front of the word narrative, because I think it adds all sorts of different complications to us. So if we say, well, we want a single narrative, that's pretty clear. I'm pretty sure if we went around the room and said, let's develop a single narrative about this place, most people would say, well, you've got to be kidding, right? That's not even going to get out of the starting blocks. So where do we go from there? We then say, oh, well, maybe we can have a shared narrative, or maybe, as has been talked about in the Victims Commission, a composite narrative. So what they mean is like a whole lot of narratives next to each other. I have sort of, or a coexisting narrative. Your narrative sits next to mine, I respect you, you respect me. I'm not so sure about that myself, but we can debate that. I like to use the idea, which again I sort of made up, of reconsidered narratives. So for me, respecting your narrative and you respecting mine, unless I'm actually going to reconsider something, doesn't mean I'm going to buy your whole narrative, but unless I'm actually going to reconsider something, I'm not sure if actually we're going very far down the line. And I think in Northern Ireland there's a tendency to say coexisting narratives. Maybe that's as good as it gets. I don't know, but that's the challenge that I think we should throw out. And I think the final part of that, and I made the point before, is maybe it's not so much about narratives, and you don't hear people talk about this, but it's about the skills you have to interpret narrative. And so it's back to that think, act, reflect, that it actually doesn't matter what the narrative is. Do you have the skills to say, what's been presented to me is a narrative, and I can deconstruct that, and I can play with that, and I can look at that differently. Because I thought you were going to be bored by now, I put up some photographs. This is a beautiful place. I don't know if you've been there, Karen. The Montesole Peace School. Yeah, so this is if you ever get offered, like I did, come and do an evaluation of a place that's up in the mountains in Italy, say yes, right? So, no, but on a serious note, Montesole Peace School is an incredible place. I think it might actually be closed now. And a few years ago, I was asked to do an evaluation of their work. And I won't go into that in great detail, but where Montesole is a place where, when the Germans were retreating in the Second World War, they carried out a whole lot of massacres, because the story was that the partisans, Italian partisans, were living in the mountains, and there were a number of massive atrocities carried out toward the end of the war. So the Montesole Peace School brings school kids there, young Italian kids, to tell them the story. You go on this walk up the mountain and you share the story, and then what it's meant to do is convert into a discussion about how you maybe deal with xenophobia and prejudice and racism in the modern day. And I got to observe a number of these workshops, and actually they were really impressive, and the feedback from it was really interesting. But there are a number of things that I think are interesting about this. Well, there are many things, but what I'm going to focus on. Firstly, what I discovered later on was that the ruins that sometimes you go up to look at, some of these have been created after the fact. So they're not really the ruins, but they're there to help create the authentic feel of the leftover house. Some of the ruins are actually real. So there's a church there, and they are real. So it's not all made up. But what's very interesting about it is that there are actually two tours that you can do up the mountain. So the one is with the Montesole Peace School, and they're really interesting. So when I observed the workshop, they bring in the 16-year-olds and they sit them down, as you saw that picture, and they start talking about what happened, and they start saying to them, well, let's talk about the German soldier. How old do you think the German soldier was? And suddenly they're having a completely different discussion, which is, well, maybe he was 18. Well, what do you think he was thinking? And they do a really good job of actually developing a type of narrative which many people here would find quite, in this wider society, not necessarily in this room, might find quite threatening if we put that into our context. They start to ask questions like, well, we've got some research that says they heard people speaking Italian. So maybe some of these soldiers weren't Germans, they were also Italians working with the Germans. And then they talk a bit about the partisans. And the partisans, they tell different stories, narratives they've collected from people who were there at the time, some of which are great about the partisans helping, others of which about the partisans raiding the local villages and people that they knew to steal food and do pretty horrible things to the local people. So they present this really complex narrative. There's another tour you can do down at the bottom of the Peace Park, takes you up as well, set up by the Italian government, very different narrative. Partisans are great. These guys were living in the mountains. At least they were fighting the Germans. Very different narrative quite devoid of a lot of some of these types of complexities. So I really just point to that because I think it gives that example where, to some degree, I could imagine if the Maze Peace Center, or whatever you want to call it, Maze Long Cache, you could imagine these like different stories, and what do we want to do with that? And that's one example, and it's an emotive one, but I mean there are many other types of things. So the final thing I will end off with is this. So my final challenge is around past and present. And to what degree do our narratives link between the past and the present? And how are our narratives linking in with how things change? And that's the stuff that I really struggle with because I'm never quite sure what are we doing. And I'm an advocate for this type of history work, and I'm an advocate for this type of work. But I just put 2 photographs there for you of Robben Island. So apparently it's now become a good place to get married. So you can like go there and you can get married, and there's a little hotel, and so that's interesting. And on one level I'm revolted by that idea. On another level I think, well, that's sort of interesting. We've turned a really horrendous place into something else, and that's positive. We're not getting hung up on the past here. We're changing the way we think about things. And that's one of the many tours of people that I've taken there. You know, everyone having their photo taken and got to go stand by the cell, and what's going on in that process. And there's a whole lot of people say this is dark tourism, this is evil, this is the work of the devil, and other people saying, well, you know, this is interesting, this is what we do. We start to recreate our pasts, and that's a positive form of change. And I throw that out as the last challenge because I always sort of am in 2 minds about that.